In your essay for the New Statesman this week, Andrew, you're talking about how a Labour government could be far bolder than any of us are currently thinking about or even considering in two ways, economically, but also when it comes to our approach to Europe. So given we've had these European Parliament elections over the weekend, let's start with Europe. Can you run through what you're arguing here?
Right. Well, as I say in the piece, writing a political essay, particularly ahead of time each week, there are various strategies that columnists use. One of the strategy is the sort of reverse ferret strategy, where you say, last week I was saying this, but I'm completely changed my mind. I'm completely wrong. I'm going to say something entirely different. In the old days, Simon Jenkins was the great proponent of that. Or you can just forge further ahead and double down on what you said. And those are two different ways of doing it. And this week I'm trying to do both at the same time. An awkward and possibly inelegant thing to be doing. But in terms of pushing forward, I was arguing last week, and I really still think the biggest single unanswered question that we should all be talking about is, what if the polls are right? What if they are remotely right and we are heading for a Labour government with a huge majority, well over 100? Some people are saying 200 or 300. I don't believe that, but a government with a huge majority. And that means, of course, a period when the Conservative Party feels kind of shattered, demoralised, is fighting with itself. We've already seen it this week about whether or not to let Nigel Farage into the Conservative Party and all of that. There is political space that comes along very rarely in British politics. And I was talking to somebody senior in the Labour Party who said, look, we'll have 18 to 24 months with a big majority when we can almost do whatever we like. We can't break all our promises, but we have fantastic space to be more radical and bolder. And this person said, the bigger the majority, the bolder we can be, the more broken and ineffective the opposition is going to be. And this is our moment. And just as there is a terrible danger about saying something in an election campaign and then breaking your promise, lying to people, in a mood where the country is very sceptical about politics. That's a big, big danger. But there's also a big danger of being too timid, too tongue-tied, not grabbing the opportunity when it comes along. And after conversations I've been having, I'm pretty clear that people around Starmer really understand that if this is going to be a successful government, the bolder they can be, the earlier, the better.
Does that mean, though, very soon into a new parliament, the public are going to see Labour break the promises that we're hearing about now? How does boldness translate into not breaking promises?
Well, that's very interesting. So the answer is, I hope not. I don't think they're going to raise income tax. I don't think they're going to raise VAT or national insurance. But I do think they're going to allow the fiscal drag of tax rates to carry on. I do think that they will look at other taxes, smaller taxes, but taxes on wealth. I think they'll at some point go for a revision of council tax bans, which is desperately needed and which would amount, in effect, to a big transfer of money from the wealthy south to the rest of the country. So I think those things will be part of it.
Because proportionately, those living in the north pay far more in council tax than in the south, don't they?
Absolutely. And those of us in the south are going to have to pay more to help that inequity. But I think Rachel Reeves, and you can see this in her Mace lecture, which she gave earlier in the year in March, has been looking very hard at other ways of finding the investment, in particular, that a Labour government will need relatively early on to persuade people that that word change, which they've made forefront in their campaign, is real. And there are various dodges and wheezes, including changing the amount of interest the Bank of England charges commercial banks on the vast amount of money it puts with them overnight. Other central banks, including the European Central Bank, do things differently. And economists who really understand this, and I cite Chris Giles from the Financial Times, Will Hutton and others, are pretty convinced that Labour could find itself another 20 to 30 billion pounds of infrastructure spending without raising taxes and without that, as it were, borrowing being on the books.
It just sounds like a complete no-brainer.
It does sound like
you can write your own rules and get more money.
It's such a no-brainer that even Nigel Farage is attracted by the same kind of policy.
So what explains why it hasn't happened already? You'd think any government would be chomping at the bit to do that.
Because the Bank of England is under the current governor, Andrew Bailey, is against it.
Right.
And presumably it will have an effect on the balance sheets of the commercial banks, but they're doing pretty well at the moment. This was done back in the 1970s, in the years of Edward Heath. It's not a new idea. It's not completely revolutionary in British banking, and it's something that's done elsewhere. And so I think an inertia, I think she has spotted something which I'm sure Jeremy Hunt wishes he had spotted too, and he's going for it. There are many other ways of, as it were, getting investment off the books, and also this hope that simply having a government which appears to be there, if it's a very big majority, you think, okay, we're probably talking about a 10-year government, and industry around the world, business around the world will look at Britain and say, well, this is a sort of stable, quite centrist, mainstream government we can rely on, which says it's not going to change tax rates of these kinds for 10 years. This is quite a safe place. In an increasingly turbulent and unsafe world, look at the politics of Europe. We'll go on to talk about that. Look at what's happening in America. Britain becomes quite a safe haven. And if that's true, then there is a wall of money coming this way, and that will help Labour enormously. But I think the ambition is to do quite a lot early on to get that money flowing and to free up the planning system and all those things.
Listening to you talk and reading your essay, you're excited about this potential new Labour government. And we see that really lacking in both across society, but also with our media rivals, don't we?
I am excited. I may be the only optimist left in the country, which is probably a temperamental thing more than anything else. But no, I am pretty optimistic. And if we turn to Europe, because that's the other area where, again, they've said we're not going back into the single market, we're not going back into the customs union, we're not going back into the EU. Well, let's wait and see. I don't think they'll go back into the EU. I think that is impossible without a referendum. Even the Liberal Democrats say that's a long-term thing. But I do think there are conversations about a much more generous and bigger and bolder relationship between the UK and the EU going forward than they've made public so far.
But how does that interact with the results that we've seen over the weekend? We've seen the Belgian Prime Minister resign after a defeat by the right. Germany's far-right AFD, they beat the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, into second place. And then in France, obviously, Emmanuel Macron has now called an emergency election because of the huge gains made by National Rally and Marine Le Pen and her party.
Looked over at Britain and looked at what Rishi Sunak had done, thought this is going so well,
yeah, exactly.
I'll do it too.
Although much quicker. I mean, how can Labour forge a closer relationship with a Europe which seems to be moving in an opposite direction to the one that they would want to go in?
Well, another way of looking at this, and maybe I am being too Panglossian here, you could argue that given the advance of the right, the nationalist right in Europe, first of all, that means that the old Europe, which is going to be one central monolith, you are in or you are out, and the Brussels bureaucrats dictated everything, is breaking apart. Mm-hmm. And that the Europe of concentric or interlocking circles that both Scholz and Macron have talked about, a looser Europe, is inevitable. And that is better for Britain, which wants a looser relationship, but with the European market. So in a way, it might play to our advantage. But also, if you say the bit that we are not connected to is the politics of Brussels. If the politics of Brussels starts to become toxic, that is the bit we don't want to be connected to. Yep. And even Europhiles might look at this and think, do you know what? Let's not be quite so close as we were. And therefore, some kind of intermediate relationship where we had much more access to the market and we had really strong security and defence and environmental agreements with the EU, but we weren't part of the political structure, might be perfect.
How do you reckon that would go down with the public?
Well, that's a very interesting question. If you look at what has happened to the Conservative vote, what's happened to the polling over the EU, I think the country has decided, not that Brexit itself isn't working or is a disaster, but that the form of Brexit that we were given by Boris Johnson has not worked. So Johnson was able, because he has this kind of political alchemy, to define Brexit as his kind of Brexit, his very hard-edged Brexit. So get Brexit done meant get my version of Brexit done, not Theresa May's version of Brexit, and not the version of Brexit that lots of Eurosceptics were talking about a couple of years earlier, where it will be definitely out, but don't worry, we'll be inside the customs union. Don't worry, we'll be inside the single market. Lots of people who were quite Brexity were saying that. Johnson redefined all of that during his period. That's what hasn't worked. And if the country feels it hasn't worked, and if the country has completely turned its back on the party which got that kind of Brexit done, then is there not space to rethink this properly and seriously?
Let's fast forward it 12 months' time. If, as the polls suggest, there will be at least one Reform MP in the form of Nigel Farage, possibly a couple more. How could this reshaping of our relationship with Europe, how is that going to play out if you've got that kind of voice? And let's just touch on some comments that surfaced yesterday from a Reform candidate who presumably will not be allowed to stand, Ian
Gribbin in Bexhill and Battle.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I tweeted about this, but really shocking.
So Richard Tice says, and there's a certain amount of truth in this, they don't have the money and they didn't have the time to scrutinise every single candidate who came forward. And it hasn't been possible.
Well, that's fair enough. Even the largest parties haven't been able to either.
But this is a really interesting moment, I think, because it challenges or provokes a debate about what the hard right is in Britain. Because if you think of somebody like Nigel Farage, he is the embodiment of the World War II nostalgic, patriotic, corduroy trousers wearing lots of little models of Spitfires in the bedroom kind of view of the world. And I'm not sneering. I had Spitfires in my bedroom when I was growing up. So, but, that is a very sort of, as it were, Churchill, the great hero. Yeah. The great heroes are Churchill and then Margaret Thatcher and so on. And he's at D-Day. Right, and he doesn't go early, and he fiercely and ferociously, and in some ways using language that's dubious, attacks Rishi Sunak for going early. So that is that kind of right-wing patriotism. But then Ian Gribbin says, do you know what, we should have done a deal with Hitler.
Stayed neutral.
We were in a much, but this ridiculous woke view, he says, in Britain, this naive belief in international law and all that stuff, stopped us doing the deal with Hitler.
So saying women should be denied healthcare.
Women are just, they just take everything. They're sponges, and we must get rid of, by the way, this cult of Churchill. And I think on the right in the UK and in Europe, and certainly in America, there are, as it were, gregarious, cheerful, clever, mould-breaking, agile politicians, and I think Farage is all of those. But behind them, there are some people with really, really dark, extreme, racist, nationalist views, and some of them with outright Nazi views. And I think what this episode does is it reminds us that when we talk about the right or the far right or the hard right, we're talking about a massive spectrum of people ranging from, the relatively acceptable to the completely disgraceful.
There are going to be people rising up the European ranks, potentially even the next Prime Minister of France, Jordan Bardella, who are going to have some serious questions raised about their past as well, aren't they? That's
absolutely right. So Jordan Bardella, very, very young, he's 28, easy on the eye, kind of youthful, cheerful. But not long ago, he was liking postings and tweetings by an organisation called the Identitarians, which is a French neo-fascist group, widely regarded as neo-fascist or fascist, who have very extreme views about Islam, very anti-American, very anti-Atlanticist, very anti-Anglo-Saxon, very anti-Islam. And they were actually banned by the French government because they were so extreme. So, all around Europe, these people are starting to pop up.
Something weird is happening here, Andrew, isn't it? Because we'll both remember particularly in the run-up to the Brexit referendum, lots of talk from those who wanted to remain that Europe is a safe haven, liberal, that's where we want to be at, and yet this was a lurch to the right, to leave, to be isolationist. Fast forward close to a decade, and things are looking rather different.
Isn't it interesting, Hannah? There has been a complete flip, really. I think you're absolutely right. You look back, and the number of people would look across at the continent and say, they're very civilized, they have good welfare societies, they're relatively moderate in their politics. They're the opposite of Trump. And we're breaking away from them, and we're going right-wing and populist, and Britain is, going to hell in a handcart. And actually, looking at this election, we don't know what's going to happen. If what happens is what looks like it's going to happen, we are the outriders. We are the more moderate, sensible, centre-left society at the moment, more open to people from outside the UK, people outside all of Europe. And it's Europe that is going through a dark and sort of reactionary phase. I once interviewed Marine Le Pen, and she was talking about the importance of tearing down the elites and so on. And I said, it sounds to me you don't just want a French revolution, you want a European revolution. And she said, no, révolution mondiale.